Another Blues Junior, a 4, though they're all pretty much the same inside. A note on that, 4 revisions of the Blues Junior and similar numbers of different versions of the Hot Rod and Blues Deluxe and DeVilles and stuff. And they keep changing the numbers and the cosmetics, and the insides of the amps have the same problems they've had for 20 years. This one says, check input jack, no signal, and has static noise. I think I've read that problem tag on a few other Blues Juniors before. I can see that the EL84s are in here at a good angle. They're like that instead of like that. The power cable. It's all twisted up like this. And when you twist a power cable up like this, it breaks. It will just break eventually. You need to learn how to coil your cables. I'm not here to teach you that. There are lots of videos on proper ways to coil cables so that you don't develop this kind of memory and things don't get hurt. And I'm gonna unwind it and try to relax it a little bit and get all the kinks out. But don't do that to your power cables, because then you've got a $300 amplifier that needs $100 worth of labor and a new $10 cord. So that's half the cost of the amp just because you didn't coil your cable correctly or bundle it correctly, or however you want to, whichever verb you want to use. Anyway, let me get the back panel off of this and we'll see what's going on. All right, I've shown this in other videos, but each time I put this in a video, it may save someone's rear panel. I've got all these screws loose. They're not tied to the chassis anymore. The panel should pull out, right? No. It's got screws on the side, which are compressing the wood from the side. Get in there and back those up just a little bit on each side. You don't want to take them out. You want to keep the chassis held in place, but just back them off a little bit so that the sides of the cab aren't pressing and compressing this way. And then the rear panel comes off very easily with no damage. Notice the big slant on these tubes. It's like the amp was dropped on this side. And that might be what's the problem. We'll find out. Input jacks are pretty fragile on these. Let me do something for the camera just so people don't have collective heart attacks. I do this in almost every video. Oh, I do this on every amp. I don't always put it in the video because I don't need to have 10 minutes of every video being the same. Make sure there's no DC waiting for us in here. 1.57 volts. 1.57 volts. But the longer I measure, the more it'll go down because the meter gives a path to ground. I don't care about 1.57 volts. It's not plugged into the wall. It's not a concern. That said, I also don't put this in every video, but every once in a while I like to repeat it. Amps can kill you. They can store high voltages. If you were to go in here while it's plugged into the wall, even if it's powered off, you could hurt yourself. Don't do that. Don't do everything that you see me or other techs do on YouTube or TV or whatever. One of the reasons we charge what we charge is we are inviting a certain amount of risk. All right, these groove tube labeled EL84s look okay. It doesn't mean that they are okay. Checking the speaker connections. Fuses don't seem to be blown. We measure them though. Sometimes a fuse can be bad even though it visibly looks okay. All right, looking at the filter caps. No obvious leakage. I suspect he's got one or more bad tube in here. One or more bad tubes. No signal. Static noise. Check input jack. He could also have a input jack that's broken off the solder joints. It's likely the hardware, the nut up top, is very loose. Can you see that? Yeah. I'm able to turn it with my fingers. So, oh, I see. They've stripped it. That jack is stripped all the way out. And the plastic back here is broken as a result too. Yeah, so they got a bad input jack. This is so stripped out that the nut actually doesn't want to come off. There's no thread left for that to grab. One other thing let me show you while I'm noticing things which are loose. See that gap and that gap there, that big gap there? The screws are totally loose, holding the handle on, which means every time you do that, the wood wears away and things are more likely to break. So Set this for a little bit higher torque. You can do that with a handheld screwdriver. Doesn't take any time whatsoever. All right, let's see if this input jack even functions. I suspect it's just a broken solder joint. Let me get set up to do that. Yeah. All right, let's change out that input jack for the guy. I get a lot of Fenders from the late 40s through the late 70s. And you know what I don't have to change on them very often? Input jacks. Sometimes I do. You know it's one of the simplest things in the world to change on an old Fender? The input jack. All right, let me make sure that the voltage is gone since I did power it on. Yeah, it's got 6.7 volts there. So I'm gonna do another way to quick and dirty discharge it now that I know that the voltage is only 6. Don't do this unless you're really sure what you're doing, because if there's a substantial voltage there, it can arc, it can blow a piece of metal that'll damage things, etc., etc. Discharging 6.7 volts, however, no big deal. Down to 0.3, that's fine. So on old Fender amps, you don't have to change input jacks very often. When you do, it's easy. Comes nowhere close to approaching the value of the amp. You get a hot rod, you get a Blues Junior, especially when it comes to the value of the amp. The Blues Junior math doesn't always make sense. And it's very, very common to have to change those input jacks. They saved the wrong couple of bucks when they made it. I should point out that it's unplugged from the wall right now, so this board's not tightened here either. It's got a lot of give. I'll tighten these screws up properly when I'm done. They really love their zip ties in these things. Even for things that don't need to be bundled together, they bundle them together. Not very good looking solder joints on this output jack either. I'll show you in just a minute. I hate the foot switch jack they use on these. It's got a plastic bushing and it often gets a little bit slightly cross-threaded even from the factory. Its mate here for the speaker at least has a metal frame bushing, a metal bushing, which much better quality. Let's take a look at these solder joints. See right here, there's a little ring around each one. Those are broken solder joints. It's hard to capture reflective silver stuff with this camera, this film camera, but these are all broken solder joints. That's a good way to lose tubes and or an output transformer. So let me get some of that old solder out and we'll reflow some good stuff in there. So I want to heat up the old solder a little bit and remind it that it is in fact solder and wants to flow. When I add that fresh solder to it, they don't mix. You can see it's a little bit grainy. That's because I have leaded solder being added and lead-free already there. But by adding that leaded solder to it, it actually adds a little bit of flux to it, which makes the old stuff flow better and come out. I could have used a flux pen. I find that this is faster. I don't have to keep reaching for different things, and there's less flux for me to clean up afterwards. So just want to get this yuck out. And some fresh 6040. And we'll do the same thing to the other pin here. Similarly crappy joints on this foot switch jack as well. I'll do it while I'm in the neighborhood. Doesn't take a lot of time. If the foot switch jacks fail, it's just an inconvenience. But the speaker jack is a very expensive inconvenience. When, not if, it causes major damage. See, we haven't even gotten to the problem the owner knows about. It's good to do this stuff semi-preventatively. I'd much rather say, I changed that because there's a danger of things going colossally wrong, rather than saying, oh, look, things went colossally wrong in your amp. Let me fix it now. I have heard horror stories of techs out there who would certainly have found what I just found and left it there, knowing that the amp would be back to them in 6 months and be more work down the road. I'm not saying, oh, I am the only honest tech out there. I am one of the honest techs out there. One of the reasons I do these videos is it helps keep me honest, and people who own the apps can see what I did and why. But there are some shysters out there who do not do very good work. I wish I hadn't said shyster. That's one of the words I'm trying to get out of my vocabulary. Anyway, got some excess flux. I'll get some alcohol, wipe that off real fast, and then we'll get back to pulling the board. Now, I wish I could say I would then have to remove the nuts on the pot shafts, but there are no nuts on the pot shafts. It's these little plastic bushings that center them in the holes a little bit. Gives the most marginal of support. All right, let's see. Are we ready to pull? I gotta disconnect this one too. Screws out. Of the 4 connections on this jack, this one's the only one that's broken. The problems are actually within the jack. It's physically, the plastic is shattered. So I'm gonna get this solder out the same way I did those output jack solder joints. But then instead of putting new solder on, I'm gonna just get this jack out. All right, jack out, old solder off, flux removed. Here's the broken jack. There's the damaged threads. It's a terrible, terrible thing that they foist upon the guitar community. Let me check my stash for a long bushing Switchcraft 12A and some isolation mount shoulder washers to fit the opening, and we'll put this thing back together better than new. Look at that pretty shallow depth of field. I'm gonna undo that cinematography so we can see what we're doing, but all right, new long bushing Switchcraft jack, cloth covered wires like on the vintage amps because it was handy and works just fine. And I'll put the shoulder washer on, pop that up, make sure the wires aren't going to interfere with the functioning of the shunt on the jack, the dress washer up top, metal washer, new metal nut. This jack, if this jack breaks, I got some bigger issues. Stop letting Godzilla use your amp. I'm going to tighten this up as much as it's possible to tighten a shoulder washer isolated jack. That's good. All right, let's button this back up and I'll do my standard bias cool down tweak and we'll see how it sounds. All right, I heard a little bit of a rushing water crackling noise when it first powered up. Seems to be better now. Probably one of the preamp tubes, we'll check that. But there's just not gonna be more problems with that input jack, so that's good. Check the tank. It works. The A-type 12-inch speaker, the Celestion A-type that they're using now, sounds so much better than the old made for Fender by Eminence speakers they used to always come with. I'm gonna keep an eye on that rushing water. It doesn't seem to be there anymore. But Lyle, you say, in the Amps Under $500 video, you warn people specifically away from the Blues Junior. Yeah, that sounds really good to me. What gives? Well, it sounds pretty good right now. The filter caps haven't failed yet. The output tube sockets haven't burned yet. The output tube sockets are much less likely to burn now because of 2 things that I've done. I cooled off the bias and I moved those ribbon cables away from that blue primary connection, which causes oscillation. Oscillation causes things to draw more current because it's amplifying frequencies that you can't even hear. So your amp is, sounds fine to you, but in frequencies we can't hear, it's on 10 at all times. It's just going crazy. So between cooling the bias and removing that oscillation, that's going to last better. The new input jack's not ever going to fail. Leaves us with those very inexpensive fragile pots, which are mounted to the board with no real mechanical support, and those IC brand filter caps. In some Fenders, I'm not sure which ears, they're Lelons rather than IC, but they're also crappy. Those will fail. And so this amp will probably come back to me at some point. It's not necessarily worth doing now. I'm going to tell the owner, just listen, if it starts to get hummy or you start to hear weird sounds, they don't often die in such a way as to burn the amp in the Blues Juniors the way they might in an old neglected, say, Super Reverb or Pro. But, that's something that can be kicked down. That's a cost to be kicked down the line a little bit. When I do that, I'll change out the 1N4006 diodes in the rectifier for some 1N4007s. But the primary cause of short tube life has already been addressed. The amp sounds pretty good. And I'm just keeping an eye on that crackly sound. I'll power cycle a few times and see if I can narrow it down to a certain tube in a certain position, see if it's even worth changing, or whether, hey, this amp makes a little bit of a crackle for the first minute it's on, then goes away. So I think the owner will be very happy with this.